Good morning, dear students. In my first video of the blue bead, we had read about the story and we had discussed about how the crocodile had emerged, its appearance, and how it was such a formidable figure in the river. We had also discussed about the fact that Sibia belonged to a very, very impoverished and poor family. So she had to face so many struggles in her life. We also discussed about her visit to the bazaar and all about all her yearnings that she had with respect to ornaments and various other things. And finally, she set out with her mother for one of her trips, and of course the other women also accompanied them, and they were going to cross the river to collect paper grass. So we had stopped over there and now we will continue from there. Such thoughts did not trouble Sibia, and the thoughts were regarding the women who were toiling all day at work while the agent was relaxing on the silk cushion smoking a hookah. So these thoughts did not trouble Sibia. However, as she skipped along with her sickle and homemade hay fork behind her mother. Now, sickle is a tool with a curved blade, and the hay fork was also a tool with sharp metal prongs, and both these tools were used for threshing the paper grass. You could skip on the way out, but not on the way back when you ached with tiredness and there was a great load to carry. Some of the women were wearing necklaces made out of lal lal beeges. Now the lal lal beeges are nothing but red seeds which were growing in the wild, and they could pluck them, and if they wanted to make ornaments, it was a very, very convenient material that they could use, and cheap as well because it was free of cost. The shiny scarlet beads, black one end that grew everywhere in the jungle. Scarlet is red. It was best to have new necklaces each year instead of last year's faded ones. And Sibia was making one too, so even she was busy making a necklace for herself. How nice it was going to be to hear that rattling swish around her neck as she froushed along with lots of necklaces. And so she was imagining and envisioning that when her necklace would be ready, she would flaunt it and she would feel so proud of herself. But each seed, hard as stone, had to be drilled with a red-hot needle, and the family needle was snapped. So she must wait till they could buy another. So because they were poor, they could not afford another needle, so she would have to wait till the family could afford to buy another needle for her necklace to be complete. Oh, for strings and strings of glass and beads, anklets, earrings, nose rings, bangles, all the gorgeous dazzle of the bazaar, all her little golden body decorated. So she was imagining if she would have all these ornaments, how beautiful and how attractive those ornaments would look on her. Chattering as they went, the women followed the dusty track toward the river. Now the women were busy gossiping and talking amongst themselves while crossing the river. On their way, they passed a Gujar encampment of grass huts. Now there was a Gujar settlement and there were a cluster of grass huts all together, and everybody was living in that one little settlement together, where these nomadic graziers would live for a time. Now these nomadic graziers are the wandering tribes. The Gujars, they were called nomadic because they were wandering tribes, and graziers because they grazed cattle. So they would live for a time until their animals had perhaps finished all the easy grazing within reach, or they were not able to sell enough of their white butter and white milk in the district, or there was no one to buy the young male buffaloes for tiger bait. And the fourth reason she gives is perhaps a cattle-killing tiger was making a nuisance of himself. Then they'd move on. So there were only these 4 reasons why they would move. If any of these reasons were met, they would decide to leave that particular encampment and move on. Sibia glanced at the Gujar woman as she went past. They wore trousers. Now the women, they wore trousers tight and wrinkled at the ankles. Unlike Sibia's mother and the other women, they wore saris, but the Gujar women wore trousers, tight and wrinkled at the ankles, and in their ears, large silver rings made out of melted rupees. And one of them was clinking a stick against the big brass garas in which they fetched water from the river for the camp. Now the big garas, the brass garas, are nothing but the pots that these women used to use for filling water. So one of the Gujar women was trying to clink and see whether the water in that pot was empty or full, to see which ones were empty. The men and boys were out of camp just now with the herd or gone to the bazaar to sell produce. So the men had gone to do the selling part. So they went to sell whatever they had. But 1 or 2 buffaloes were standing about, creatures of great wet noses and moving jaws and gaunt black bones. So the only animal that they could see there in the vicinity were 1 or 2 buffaloes who were described as having the great wet noses. They had jaws which were moving and thin black bones. The Gujars were junglis. Junglis means they were uncivilized and barbaric people, as Sibia was too. Even Sibia and the women in her village, they were also uncivilized, born and bred in the forest. For countless centuries, their forebears had lived like this, getting their living from animals, from grass and trees, as they scratched their food together. So this is how they used to get their food. They never really believed in cultivation at that time because it was not even known to them. So their ancestors or their forebears also lived in a similar manner and stored their substance in large herds and silver jewelry. So they invested their money in large herds and silver jewelry. They were man in the wandering pastoral age. So they were men in the rural age, and they were not Stone Age hunters and not yet cultivators. Now there was the river twinkling between the trees, sunlit beyond dark trunks. Now the river could be seen twinkling between the trees. It was meandering, and you could see the sunlight beyond the trunks of the trees. They could hear it rushing along. The women came out on the shore and made for the stepping stones. They had plenty to laugh and bicker about, so they were busy laughing and arguing among themselves as they approached the river in a noisy crowd. They girded up their skirts, means they lifted up their skirts so as to jump from stone to stone, and they clanked their sickles and forks together over their shoulders to have ease of movement. So they were keeping all their tools on their shoulders so that it was the mobility and the movement was easy for them. They shouted their quarrels above the gush of the river. So the river was also meandering and you could hear the sound of the river, but their quarrels were far louder than that. Noise frightens crocodiles. Now we know that noise always frightens animals, especially crocodiles here in this case. The big mugger or the crocodile did not move, and all the women crossed in safety to the other bank. Here they had to climb a still hillside to get at the grass, but all fell to with a will and sliced away at it wherever there was foothold to be had. So while they were climbing the hillside, wherever they got some support for their foot, they would climb over there, and they did not bother even if sometimes they got separated from the group of women. As long as they got support there to put their feet on that particular hill, they used to give that preference, and in the process they would sometimes separate also. Down below them ran the broad river, pouring powerfully out from its deep narrow pools among the cold cliffs and shadows. So the river, it was meandering and pouring from its pools among the cold cliffs, and it was spreading into warm shallows. And those warm shallows were the shallow area of the river which was lit by kingfishers. Now kingfishers are birds. Great turtles lived there. So wherever the shallow water was found, we found these birds, and the turtles had also infested that part of the river. And Maaser is actually a large fish. Now the Maaser was weighing more than 100 pounds. Crocodiles too. Crocodiles were also very, very heavy reptiles, just like the Maaser. Sometimes you could see them lying out on those slabs of clay over there, but there were none to be seen at the moment. Now the crocodiles would sometimes, in the shallow parts where there were the sandbanks, they would lie on those slabs, and they would be completely smeared with clay over their bodies, and then when they would dry up, they would turn white, and then they would again move back into the river. Where Sibia was working, wind coming across hundreds of miles of trees cooled her sweating body, and she could look down over the river as if she were a bird. So because she was a young girl, she was full of imagination, and therefore when she had crossed many miles, she would look from above and she would look down at the river and imagine that she was a bird who could fly. Although she did not dare stop for a moment under her mother's eye, her imagination took her in swooping flight over the bright water and golden air to the banks where she had played as a child. Now she was, of course, she knew that her mother was always keeping a strict vigil on her. She was, monitoring her daughter, and therefore she did not let her imagination, go too beyond a particular point. So she would imagine things, but then she would again come back to reality, and she also thought of that river and imagined how she used to play on the banks as a child. In those cavelets are small caves, so in those cavelets above the high water mark of the highest flood, she had stored some little bowls molded of clay while they hardened. So she had prepared these clay bowls and she was waiting for them to dry up, because when they would dry up, they would turn hard. If there were anything that could be used for coloring, they would look fine, painted with marigolds and elephants. Marigolds are golden flowers. Child, now her mother immediately reprimands her and scolds her. She says, child, the sharp word, the glare of her mother's angry, sweating face pulled Sibia back to work, and they toiled on. So her mother's glare or her stare was enough for Sibia, and immediately she came back to reality, back to work, and they started laboring and toiling. But at last it was time to go back to see their animals and the evening meal. The loaded women set out to cross the river again. Now the women were worried about the animals that they had to tend back home, as well as they had to organize the evening meal because their husbands would be back from work as well. Sibia hung back. She would just dawdle a bit. Dawdle means she used to linger and move slowly because obviously she was a little girl and she used to get tired also. So she would just dawdle a bit and run and see if the little clay cups were still there in the cave, waiting to be painted and used. Although the women were now tired and loaded, they still talked. The women were tired, but still their capacity for gossiping never ended, and they continued talking even on the way back. Those in front yelled to those behind. They crossed the river safely and disappeared up the track into the trees on the other side. Now the women had already crossed the river and they were very safe and sound. Even their voices died away, and gradually even their voices could not be heard. They faded away. Silence fell. Sibia came down alone to the stepping stones. The light of evening was striking up the gorge. The gorge is nothing but a valley, pink into the ultraviolet shadows. Now that the sun was off it, the water poured almost invisible among the stones, with no reflection to show where it began. So, because now that the sun had started setting, it was twilight, the water also seemed invisible among the stones. And whatever little light was there, it was not enough to identify the source of the water. Sibia stepped onto the first stone. She was heavily weighted. Now, why was she heavily weighted? Was because not that she was a fat girl, but the fact that she had the paper grass on her shoulders, she had a hay fork and sickle on her shoulders, made her shoulders heave. Her muscles stretched and aching. The hay fork squeaked in the packed dry grass and dug into her collarbone, so close under the skin. Now the hay fork, which was on her shoulder, was also hurting her skin. In spite of the sari bunched up to make a pad. Now she had made a little, soft kind of a pad over there on which she had placed the hay fork so that her shoulders and her collarbone would not hurt. Yet with the weight, gradually it kept on, the weight kept piercing her skin, and she was feeling tired, and also she was feeling a lot of discomfort. When she was halfway over, means when half her journey was over, she put her load down on a big boulder to rest. So she put all her load down on a big huge rock and leaned. She bent down, breathing on the fork. At the same moment, a Gujjar woman came down with 2 garras to the water on the other side. Now she noticed that there was a Gujjar woman who came. She probably wanted to come and fill the garras, her pitchers, and she had come to fill those pitchers on her pots to the river on the other side. In order to get the good clear water which would quickly fill both garras to the top without sand, she walked on to the stepping stones. So she had planned to fill both the pots, and so she climbed on to the stepping stones or the cobblestones. She was within a yard of the crocodile when he lunged at her. Now she was barely a yard away when the crocodile lunged, means he moved forward to attack this Gujjar woman. Up out of the darkling water heaved the great reptile. Now this reptile or the crocodile, it was growing dark. The water was darkling, means it was growing dark, and the water was slushing off him. His livid and angry jaws were yawning and all his teeth were flashing, and he slashed at her leg. He struck at her leg. The woman screamed. Of course, she was very, very upset. She was very, very traumatized with that. And she dropped both her brass pots with a clatter on the boulder, from whence they bounced to the water, and Sibia saw them bob away in the current. Oh, the 2 vessels, the 2 good vessels gone. So here she noticed that the woman had dropped her pots because the crocodile had struck at her leg. So in that she was terrified, and she dropped the 2 brass pots, which actually bounced off and bounced away and bobbed away with the current. Of course, she said at that time, Sibia's first reaction was that the 2 good vessels were gone. So children, this is all for now, and I am giving you this worksheet that I want all of you to do in your fair exercise books, and we will be wrapping up the third, the story, the theme, title, justification, the character sketches, all that will be covered in my third video. So till then children, have a wonderful day and God bless you all.